Thanks, Sven. Thank you all. My name is Ted Lechterman. I'm a philosophy professor at IE University in Spain, where I hold the UNESCO chair in AI ethics and governance. I'll be speaking today about some ideas from my own research. And these views may or may not necessarily represent the views of any organization with which I am affiliated. But what I want to talk about today is democratization in AI. Democratization is a term we are hearing more and more about in the AI field. It's a concept, it's an ideal that many of us are very passionate about. But I think the most prominent understandings of this idea of AI democratization don't get the picture quite right. I'll tell you what I mean. There's one view that I'm calling the security view, and this is associated perhaps most prominently with Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, though there are many other people who share this basic idea. So Sam Altman has been making the rounds recently calling for democratic AI to defeat authoritarian AI. And the essence of the security view, I think, is this. The value of democracy directs citizens of democratic societies to protect their societies and institutions from threats. Right? If we are fortunate enough to live in a basically democratic society, that's a remarkable achievement, and we should do what we can to maintain it, to protect it. AI can be a threat when it falls into the hands of authoritarian regimes. Right? AI can empower authoritarian regimes, rivals of democracies, with democracy-eroding capabilities. How can this happen? Well, in a couple of ways. First of all, through weaponization. If violence is your aim, AI can offer you an especially powerful tool for making violence more effective or more lethal. Right? So AI can enable information warfare through disinformation and other methods. It can facilitate cyber attacks. It can automate decisions about who lives and dies in the battlefield through lethal autonomous weapons, and so on. Additionally, Altman and people in this school of thought are worried about the economic dominance that may be conferred by AI supremacy. If authoritarian regimes were to gain AI supremacy, this would allow them to enjoy enormous wealth, tremendous economic power, which could then be easily transferred into geopolitical and military power, allowing them to call shots to dictate the terms of trade and international relations more generally. So, in the view of Altman and others, democratizing AI is fundamentally about maximizing investment in AI capabilities within democratic societies, also imposing export controls on where this technology goes abroad, as well as hardware and other essential resources, and making deeper investments into cybersecurity, all with the idea of maintaining an advantage in democratic societies over AI, preventing AI from falling into the hands of authoritarian regimes. Now, I don't want to take a stand on whether the security view is correct. It might be correct, it might be wrong. I don't have the expertise to judge that question. That's a question mainly for scholars and experts in security studies. But what I do want to say is that I think the security view is at least incomplete. It's an incomplete understanding of what it ought to mean to democratize AI, or the demands that democracy makes on AI. And we can see that with the following question. If we were able to keep AI completely out of the hands of authoritarian regimes, would we have succeeded in democratizing AI? Would we have succeeded in sufficiently living up to the demands that democracy places on us and the technologies that we create? And I think the answer has to be no, right? Keeping AI out of the hands of authoritarian regimes is consistent with maintaining significant inequalities within democratic societies, inequalities in power over AI, inequalities in access to AI, and many other kinds of inequalities that we might think are democratically suspect. So I think we need to look beyond the security view. The next candidate is something I'm calling the access view. The access view is especially popular with professionals in the AI community, data scientists, engineers, software developers. Here you can see a screenshot from an agency called Turing. Turing is an agency that connects AI talent to AI firms, not to be confused with the Alan Turing Institute in the UK, which is a publicly funded think tank. But Turing, the staffing agency, has produced this ultimate guide to democratization in artificial intelligence, where it defines AI democratization as making AI available for all. Making AI available, accessible to people who do not necessarily have any particular expertise in coding, in machine learning, in data science, and don't have access to specialized hardware or software. So that's the essence of the access view. And the claim here is that the mass marketing of AI broadens opportunities for using it and the many benefits that come from using AI. And this is something to be celebrated and encouraged. And that's not a claim I want to dispute. I think there's a lot of truth to that claim. But what I find odd here is the identification of this idea with the term democracy or democratization. Democracy, in the sort of classical understanding of the term, means rule by the many, power of the many, right? It does not ordinarily mean product consumption by the many. So there's something a little bit strange about using democratic language to talk about mass marketing or product consumption. And I think what might be going on here is that the English language lacks a neat term to describe this process of making a product more widely available. Right? There is no obvious term to use to describe this process, and I think people have been appropriating democratic language, partly because that makes it sexier. Right? Democracy is associated with romantic ideals like liberation and revolution. If we can borrow democratic language and inject it into what would otherwise be rather dry discussions of marketing strategy or business strategy, that might be a success. So there's a sort of cynical interpretation of what's going on here with a sort of appropriation or misappropriation of democratic language into sort of ordinary business strategy discussions. But I think there's also potentially a more charitable interpretation here, which is that access to AI is increasingly becoming a democratic concern. And it's increasingly becoming a democratic concern as it influences effective participation in society, especially if we project outwards by several years. And there's an instructive analogy to internet access. Right? When the internet was invented several decades ago, nobody thought that access to the internet could be considered a basic right or a political right. At the time, it was just a kooky method for scientists to communicate with each other. Right? But now, the idea that access to internet is essential for participation in public life, to be considered an equal citizen, is a pretty commonplace idea. And in fact, people who lack reliable access to the internet are understood to occupy an unfortunate and second-class citizenship status. So I think something similar might be going on with AI. We could consider access to AI a matter of democratic concern insofar as AI confers essential opportunities for participation in public life. But even if we accept this charitable interpretation of the access view, it raises certain concerns or objections. One is the question of whether AI accessibility is really the responsibility of firms themselves. We don't normally think that firms are required to make their products available to anybody who may want to use them, regardless of their ability to pay or regardless of their expertise or credentials, right? Also, I want to go back to the original idea of democracy as rule by the many, or power of the many. We customarily think that democracy is fundamentally about power. It's not, or not only, about access to products. So I think we need to still look further. Here's a third view of what it might mean to democratize AI, or the demands that democracy makes on AI. What I'm calling the input view. It comes in a few different varieties. Here you can see a screenshot from OpenAI's website. A year ago, OpenAI put out a call for research applications for a program called Democratic Inputs to AI. Now, OpenAI, as you may know, trains its GPT models through a process called reinforcement learning with human feedback, where basically the models train themselves on the basis of large troves of data, and then human moderators and users can upvote or downvote the results of those models, depending on whether they like them or find them helpful. So this is a process that doesn't allow for a tremendous amount of human input from people who may be affected by AI products, but aren't necessarily involved as users or as moderators. So OpenAI is concerned about the social consequences of its models. Its GPT models have become foundation models. They power an increasing range of downstream uses that are used by governments, by other corporations, by individuals in their own lives, all with tremendous effects, both actual and projected, on societal life. OpenAI claims in this call for research proposals that no single company or no single group of customers should have the exclusive authority to determine how foundation models are trained, given their tremendous social consequences. So it's been exploring different ways of widening input from stakeholders into the process of model fine-tuning. We see another example from Anthropic, one of OpenAI's main rivals. So Anthropic trains its models through a slightly different process called reinforcement learning with AI feedback, where a bunch of humans at Anthropic get together and create some fundamental rules for the model to abide by in advance, what Anthropic calls a constitution. And then it uses another AI program to ensure that during the reinforcement learning process, that the model actually trains itself in accordance with these principles that the humans have designed. Now, as I said, Anthropic initially conceived this process internally. It's Anthropic staff members who developed Anthropic's constitution. But Anthropic, along with researchers, has been exploring how this constitutional framing process could be widened to include input from different stakeholders throughout society, so that we could have a collective constitutional AI in Anthropic's terms. So the input view, I think, can be distilled thus. It's based on this idea that everyone who's subjected involuntarily to a socio-technical system deserves a voice in its governance, deserves a voice in the terms on which it operates. And we are increasingly subjected to foundation models, whether we like it or not. These models increasingly power many aspects of society. Many decisions are made or influenced with the help of these models. And yet, control over these models is concentrated in the hands of a few firms. And that's partly because of scaling laws and how expensive it is to train a foundation model, how time-intensive it is. So we can't reasonably expect that more competition might actually free up the market. We're stuck with market concentration in AI. So therefore, these big AI firms, which control the terms on which these foundation models operate, ought to create more opportunities for public input. That, I think, is in essence the input view of AI democratization. And I think this understanding appropriately captures this idea that democratization is ultimately about power and not only about access or security, but it also gives rise to a few more objections. The first is a capacity worry, that firms simply lack the capacity to provide fair input opportunities to everyone who may be subjected to these models. Right? If everyone, literally everyone, is subjected to foundation models, then it would seem like fair input requires Anthropic and OpenAI to run national or global participatory processes. And if these participatory processes involve deliberation and reflection, that's going to be incredibly time-intensive, incredibly expensive, incredibly resource-intensive, that I think not even the biggest AI firm could be able to afford. So a capacity concern. There's also a question of accountability here, right? That firms may or may not be trusted to respect these democratic outcomes voluntarily. The way Anthropic and OpenAI have imagined these processes so far is that OpenAI and Anthropic would in fact be controlling these democratic input processes. They would have the authority to determine whether to accept or reject certain recommendations from the public input process, how to interpret the results of that process, how to resolve disagreements, how to enforce, how to hold themselves accountable to those results. And there's a long tradition of thought in political theory which says that the separation of powers is necessary to prevent abuses of power and to ensure accountability. A third concern is that this may be reinventing the wheel. Many societies already have fairly robust processes for incorporating public input, such as elections, such as public commentary processes and administrative rulemaking, such as referenda, such as citizens' assemblies, and so on. And the question is, why should we create an additional parallel process for gathering input into AI when we already have, in many places, fairly robust systems for gathering public input into many matters of public concern? Why can't we develop or work on or adapt the systems that we already have? So all of this has been driving to what I'm calling the public governance view, which is a view I'm developing. And the public governance view holds that AI access and AI input are not primarily private concerns to be managed by firms themselves, but rather they are public concerns that demand government solutions. Government solutions such as subsidies, regulation, investment in training and education, as well as developing the participatory processes that we already have, such as elections, such as public comment on administrative rulemaking, citizens' assemblies, deliberative polls, and so on. Now, of course, democratic governments can be slow. They're not always up to the task, right? But I think in that case, our first priority should be to try to strengthen public democratic infrastructure rather than to ignore it, circumvent it, or work around it. Now, of course, the resources for public democratic infrastructure, capabilities for public democratic infrastructure are unequally distributed around the world. And so there may be certain cases where public democratic solutions are not realistically achievable in the short or medium term. I accept that. And in those cases, I think we can be looking at second-best alternatives. But I don't think the second-best alternatives is to rely on AI firms themselves. Those alternatives, I think, should naturally be led by more independent third parties, such as multilateral organizations like UN bodies or regional associations like the African Union, as well as members of global civil society, such as NGOs and foundations, with the idea of transitioning authority for managing these processes to public authorities if and when they become available. So let me leave you with some final thoughts. You may have thought this is all just a philosophical word game, as most philosophy talks are, but in situations like this, I'm reminded of this quote from Albert Camus, who said that misnaming things adds to the misery of the world. And I think this quote is especially important when we're talking about moral and political concepts that determine how we act, how we evaluate policies, and what we should do. Democratic AI will remain a fantasy if we continue to use this term loosely, if we continue to throw around the term democratization of AI. But it can become a reality if we get serious about understanding what democracy means and the demands that it makes on us and the technologies that we create. Thank you very much. I think we have a minute for questions, but I'll be around for the rest of the next couple of days if anybody would like to follow up on anything I've said here.
Yes, thanks so much, Ted, and very inspiring words. I think we can do one question, so I saw a hand up in the front.
Yes, thank you. My name is John Webber. Thank you for the inspiring presentation. We just managed in Europe to do this Data Service Act, all the acts on consumers. What is going in your direction? And now we have a lot of pressure also here that this is all too slow and this is all not working. My question is, when we are, as you said in the last sentences, if we are going slow, however, we need to go that way to make sure that the people that are involved are not having a negative impact of the use of IE, what is now in the IE Act written. How would you, according to your thinking, as you said before, how would you measure that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I personally am not upset about slow and steady. I think the kind of slowness that democracy gives us is in fact desirable. We need time for reflection, for study, to understand the possible effects of different courses of action. Though I do think at least one person I've talked about in this talk would not be happy with the slowness of democratic regulation and public policy making. And that would be Sam Altman and the Security View folks, right? They are worried, maybe for different reasons, about slowness being a barrier to competitiveness and to national security. So that's, I think, the view that we need to contend with if we are sympathetic to the idea that democracy requires time for reflection, for study. That's all I can say now, but happy to follow up later. Thanks.
So Ted, I was listening to your presentation as an economist. So I was nodding a lot, thinking about, okay, yeah, you're talking about externalities and public goods and
natural monopolies,
natural monopolies, and we've been dealing that for a lot always. And government and government is often a role played by the government is a solution to that. But the big challenge is here we're dealing with global systems. And you touched a bit upon that, but how do you see that, the global challenge and in relation to democratization?
I think that is really one of the biggest outstanding questions here. How can we simulate something like a global democracy or global democratic processes when in fact we do not have a world state and we do not have even democratic capabilities around the world? So we need to be thinking about second best alternatives. And that's why I think, the role played by multilateral organizations and civil society is quite important to be focusing on here, rather than what we may be offered by big AI firms who are trying to take over this process themselves, often with good intentions, but I think the results could be quite destabilizing.
Yeah. And that brings us back to also the link with UNESCO that you have and the role that you can play. So thanks very much for your very inspiring talk. Again, a big applause for Ted.